It's time now for a special edition of French Connections here on France 24. Earlier, my colleague Jeannie Gaudula spoke to Florence Villemenon about D-Day and its place in French history. In this week's French Connections, we're going to focus on D-Day, the 75th anniversary, and the Battle of Normandy with Florence Villemenon. Hey, Flo. It's such a vast subject. So really, we're going to focus right now on the French perspective, how this longest day was experienced here in France.
It's such a fascinating topic, Jeannie, but before we dive in, there's one thing we have to get straight, and that is how the French actually talk about D-Day. They don't refer to it as le jour J, if you will. Let's take a look at what they say. It's our words du jour. It's essentially the débarquement de Normandy, so the Normandy landing. Débarquement quite literally means a disembarkment, so a marine assault. But what's interesting is if you say le débarquement, people will definitely know what you're talking about.
And the commemoration ceremonies this year are particularly heavy with emotion. This is the 75th anniversary, and it could be one of the very last we see with living veterans from the greatest generation.
And so many people feel emotional about that because in France, many civilians who were children at the time still remember that day. And 75 years later, there's still so much gratitude for the Allied troops who participated in D-Day because, remember, France had been occupied by the Nazis for 4 years. And so the Allies here were really welcomed as heroes. There's the feeling that we would still be speaking German in many ways had it not been for their sacrifice. Let's take a listen to some of these people remembering that moment.
I remember we gave the soldiers flowers from our garden. They must have been embarrassed, and they pulled out chocolate and chewing gum out of their pockets for us kids.
They gave us chewing gum, chocolate. I swallowed the chewing gum because I didn't know what it was.
The Allied soldier came towards us. We threw ourselves on him and kissed him. And as a family, we hugged each other. And that's how we knew it was over.
Now, the outpour of gratitude from locals towards these liberators actually sometimes turned into real love stories, Jeannie. An estimated 6,000 French women actually went on to marry American GIs following the Normandy invasion. Now, there is, unfortunately, a darker side to the story as well, which is that there were several accounts of rape actually carried out by some of the Allied soldiers on local women. And unfortunately, these stories have tended to be brushed aside, if you will, by history.
Now, even though some of those darker aspects may have been forgotten, there is a definite feeling that the events that happened on D-Day should not be forgotten at all, and there's a real effort to keep that history alive.
Well, French kids spend a lot of time actually learning about World War II and the D-Day invasion, say a lot more than we learn about the Algerian War or colonialism, and there's an expression for this in France, and that is the devoir de mémoire. There's a duty to remember, and a lot of the historic landscapes in Normandy have been preserved, like these bunkers you can see here. And then, of course, there is the American cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer. It's one of the most visited places in France, over a million visitors a year, and most of them are actually French. I've definitely been there on a class trip, and it's so moving to see those 9,388 white tombstones. They're all turned west towards the United States. Remember, the average age of the soldiers buried there is 24 years old. It's an emotional place for all ages. Take a listen.
It's moving. They sacrificed their lives for us, so we could have a better life.
To think they said we're going to free France, but we don't know where we're going, and we may never go home. I want to say thank you to them.
There's something about this place. It's hard to explain. I'm getting all choked up. It's about memory. I remember them, and I have a lot of admiration for them.
So, of course, when we talk about D-Day, we talk a lot about the Allied forces who took place in the Normandy landings, but there were also French troops who participated.
This is the so-called Commando Kiefer, the Green Berets from the Free French Army. Now, their numbers are minor compared to the other allies, so the US or British or Canadian troops. There were just 177 of these French troops that landed on Sword Beach. It was symbolic, but very important because, remember, General Charles de Gaulle had kind of been left out of the loop, essentially, of the whole invasion until the very last minute. And so this was a way for them to save face.
This is where we landed. I wasn't scared, and neither were my fellow soldiers. We were coming home. We were motivated, well-trained. We were 100% pumped up. I'm happy to see kids playing on the beach. They don't know it was full of blood at one point, that lots of people died and were wounded. It's good that they're playing and don't know.
What's interesting is that veteran said that he hopes that people will actually perhaps one day forget the Normandy invasion. But the truth is the freedom that we know today and enjoy across France and most of Europe was born on these beaches in Normandy. And so it's something that, as a nation, France will never forget.
Florence Villeminot, thank you so much for that. Don't forget, if you have any questions about France or the French, you can always send a tweet to Flo at Flo Villeminot. That wraps it